All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is our third and our final session of the Fill Your Pantry Canning with Confidence webinar series. And this one, of course, is on pressure canning. Before we start, we are going to ask that you please mute your microphones and make sure that your camera is turned off. And that way we're going to have a strong bandwidth throughout our presentation. We do welcome you to use the chat box throughout the webinar to ask questions. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to try to get through as many of those questions as we can before our time concludes. And at the end of today's webinar, we will include a link to a short survey. And so we do greatly appreciate your participation and your feedback. As I mentioned, today's webinar is being recorded, and you will be emailed the recording along with all three of the webinars, PowerPoints, handouts, all the recordings and the evaluations after today's session. So just give us a couple of weeks to get all of this compiled and emailed to you. Today's session, like I said, is going to cover pressure canning. So we're going to include how to safely use that pressure canner, and you'll get to watch a video demonstration showing that canner in action. And so we hope that by the end of the presentation, you'll be, of course, canning with confidence. All right, so the University of Illinois Extension is the flagship outreach effort of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And we offer research-based educational programs to residents of Illinois in all 102 counties and far beyond. I am your moderator, Jenna Smith, University of Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness Educator, serving Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties. And our presenter today is Mary Liz Wright. She is a University of Illinois Extension Nutrition and Wellness Educator, serving Clark, Crawford, and Edgar counties. So again, please turn off your cameras and mute your audio. We hope that you have questions, so please type them in the chat as we go along, and we will answer them at the end. Welcome to everyone once again, and I am now going to go ahead and turn it over to Mary Liz for her presentation.
Thanks so much, Jenna. And as Jenna said, we are absolutely thrilled that you have joined us today, and we're here today to talk about food preservation. So why do we even want to preserve our food? Well, you know, sometimes we have an abundant garden, or we have a neighbor that dumps off a bag of produce on our porch, and we don't want it to go to waste. And so what do we need to do? Well, there's several ways you can preserve food. We know that we're here to learn about canning, but you can also freeze, dry, ferment, or pickle foods. And we do that because we want to slow down that decay process. So you know, nature designs our produce to begin the enzymatic or the decay process as soon as we harvest that item. Nature wants that item to decay and provide food for the seed contained inside so that it can grow the next generation. Well, we want to interrupt that process and have for our families wholesome food that will stay either in the freezer or on the shelf for many months, and so that we can enjoy food year round. People preserve food because they want to know what's in their food. They, like I said, they have an excess of garden produce, or they just like the way it tastes. And so we're glad that you are among those folks who are interested in preserving food. As I said, foods begin to perish quickly. Isn't this a lovely picture? I was pretty proud of myself when I found that picture. But anyway, we don't want our food to look like that because that is wasteful. And we want to be good stewards of the food that we are in charge of. So one of the reasons that we preserve food, of course, is to prevent the spoilage, but we also want to make sure we're not making anyone ill from eating our food. And so we want to pay particular attention to keeping the food safe that we are going to be offering people. And we can do that by several means. You know, we keep things clean, we keep things separate. So if we're talking about raw foods as opposed to those that we will be cooking, we want to keep those separate. We want to cook things to a safe temperature, or we want to chill things. And so all of those steps are involved in food preservation. And we're going to be going over some of those here in the subsequent slides. We want to pay particular attention and assume that really anyone can get what we call food poisoning or foodborne illness, but there are some groups in particular who are more susceptible. And we want to make sure that we're not making any of those folks sick. So the illustration there shows us very young children, the elderly, women who are pregnant, people with immune compromised, either due to medication or illness. And so that is one of our concerns. And if we follow our directions, then we don't have to worry too much about that. And so that's a good thing. So we're here today to talk about pressure canning. And every time I talk about pressure canning, someone will raise their hand and they'll tell me the story about great Aunt Tilly that was canning peaches, and the canner exploded and she had peaches all over the kitchen, including the ceiling. And I agree, they're not making those stories up. But a couple of things to keep in mind. One, the canners made today, or really after 1985, are much more safe. They have the safety mechanisms built into them. And secondly, pressure canning or preserving food in general is science, but it's not rocket science. And as long as you follow the canner manufacturing directions and you use a tested and approved recipe, you'll be just fine. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn something. First and foremost, well-preserved food begins in the garden. One thing that we don't really think about is washing our hands before we go to the garden. We all know that we need to wash them afterwards, but think about this for a minute. We all learned over the past few years that washing hands is so very important, and whatever germs that we are carrying on our hands out to the garden will then be transferred onto the produce. And so wash those hands before you go. Always use food safe containers for harvesting. And that sounds kind of interesting in and of itself. However, what we don't want you to do, and I know it's tempting, is to take, for example, a large plastic trash bag out to the garden to pick produce. Now that sounds reasonable enough. You know, you've got plenty of them. It's light, you can drag it through the rows, but let's think about this for a minute. The trash bag plastic is not designed to hold food. That's number one. Usually when we go to our garden, it's high summer, it's hot. The produce itself is warm. So you combine the hot sun, the warm earth, the warm produce inside that plastic bag, there is a chance that harmful chemicals could leach onto your produce, and nobody wants that. So food safe containers, or at the very least, a cardboard or wooden box would be better than a plastic bag. The other thing we want you to do is brush the dirt off in the garden, but only wash your produce just before using. So either just before eating it or just before getting it ready to can. And the reason we do that is because bacteria likes warm, moist surfaces to live on. And so we want to discourage the bacterial growth as much as possible. So just wash that produce only just very close to using it. As we said, we want to keep everything clean. Wash your hands again after coming in. Clean all work surfaces with hot soapy water. And if you want to, after washing and rinsing those surfaces, you can also sanitize them with a bleach solution. And really, it's only 1 teaspoon of chlorine bleach. Don't use the scented or the anti-splash. To 1 quart of water in a spray bottle. Spray it on and then let it dry. More is not better when we're talking about bleach. If your kitchen smells like a swimming pool, you're using too much bleach. So when we're talking about food preservation, there are 2 types of canning. And so we have the canning procedures that are used with high acid foods. Foods naturally high in acid are most fruits, We also add acid to certain things, pickles, for example, or other vegetable pickles, where we add vinegar. Salsa, same thing. We add an acid to that. Jams, jellies, and tomatoes and figs with lemon juice or citric acid added. Those types of foods can be processed in a boiling water bath. But today we're talking about pressure canning. And so the foods that we need to use a pressure canner for are those low acid foods, or foods with a pH higher than 4.6. You can see on the chart there. So our vegetables, certainly our crops that grow underground, combination foods, squashes and pumpkins, soups, stews, meats, poultry, and seafood. It's very important to can those things, process them in a pressure canner. It's absolutely imperative that you use a pressure canner on those types of foods. You'll notice when I put pumpkin on this slide, I said cubed. It has been determined by the USDA that mashed pumpkin, or pumpkin that looks like the commercially canned pumpkin you would buy in the store, is not deemed safe for home canning. So the only way you can can pumpkin is to cube it and then put it into your jar with water, following a recipe from the USDA or your local extension service. I mentioned tomatoes. Tomatoes fall on the borderline. And so that's why we want to make sure that we are adding acid to tomatoes before we can them. And how do we add that acid? Well, we can use a couple of different means to lower the pH or raise the acid of our tomatoes. And what we need to do is add 2 tablespoons of bottled lemon juice. And we don't want to use fresh lemons, because you line 5 lemons up on your counter, one of them is going to be different in acidic level to each of the others. And so we want a uniform level of acidity. And so that's why we use just the classic concentrated green bottled lemon juice that you can buy in any grocery store. So we need 2 tablespoons per quart, or you can use a half teaspoon of citric acid, or 4 tablespoons of 5% vinegar. Make sure your vinegar says 5% acidity. We don't want to be using any flavored vinegars or a balsamic vinegar or anything like that. So I have found the lemon juice to be the best for my palate anyway. I think it actually brightens the flavor, and it adds that necessary acid. There's 3 different kinds of approved canning methods. The boiling water bath canning that we covered a couple of weeks ago when Susan Glassman showed you how to can apple pie filling. We have the steam canning, and this is a more recent addition. And Kristen Bogdanis showed us how to use the steam canner to can jam. And then today we're going to be talking about pressure canning. And this is the method used for any low acid food. And the reason that we must use the pressure canner is because to kill the deadly pathogen bacteria, Clostridium botulinum, we must process it at 240 degrees. Well, we know that water boils around 212 degrees, depending on your elevation. Often I'll have people say, well, I still use a boiling water bath canner for my green beans, but I just boil it for 3 hours. That's the way my grandma did it. And unfortunately, that is never going to get hot enough to kill the botulism. Because I don't care how long you boil something, 212 is 212 is 212. In order to get it up to 240 degrees, to kill botulism, you must use a pressure canner. So again, you might be scratching your head and say, well, why do we have to use the pressure canner again? Please explain that to me. Well, botulism naturally occurring in our soil. It's a bacteria that is everywhere, and it doesn't cause us any harm unless it is given the environment that it really likes. And so the ideal environment for botulism to produce spores is the anaerobic, or the absence of oxygen, room temperature, low acid environment in the inside of a steel jar. Now, if you have botulism toxins in your home canned goods, you're not going to know. You can't see it, smell it, or taste it. And so that's why we want to make absolutely sure we're doing everything right so that we don't have any botulism contamination in our home canned foods. The other scary thing about botulism is it's not a classic foodborne illness symptom. There's no digestive upset. It's a neuromuscular toxin, and it can cause paralysis and can even lead to death. And so that's why we're very serious about this. I did a program yesterday, and one of the participants told me that she always cans her potatoes in a boiling water bath. And I had to say, well, I hope that you no longer will do that, because you are putting people at risk, because it has to be 240 degrees to kill botulism. All right, so let's move on and talk about, we've decided to pressure can. What do we need? Well, you need a canner, you need some jars, you need some auxiliary equipment, but most importantly, you need the right kind of heat source. So a gas stove, absolutely great. The electric stove with a coiled burner, also absolutely. But what we don't recommend is a glass top ceramic stovetop. And that being said, there are some glass top stovetops that might allow you to use a pressure canner, but we have to remember a pressure canner full of water and jars is very heavy. It could scratch or crack your ceramic top. The other thing, most ceramic tops will only allow a very flat surface for your pans. Many canners have a ridged surface on the bottom of the canner. You'll also notice when you look at your burners on your flat top stove, when they heat up, they'll get cherry red and then they'll fade away, and then cherry red and then fade away. So we need a consistent source of heat in order to raise the pressure and the temperature inside that canner to a safe degree. So use a gas stove or an electric coil type. We also don't use an electric pressure cooker. Some of the electric pressure cookers will say that you can can in them, and we recommend that you do not. There are some electric canners out there, the standalone canners. Usually they're for the water bath canning. So make sure you know what you're purchasing. Look for that underwriter's laboratory stamp of approval, and know that electric canners are not the same as a pressure canner, or electric pressure cookers are not the same, certainly. So this is what a pressure canner looks like on the inside. Usually they're pretty much the same. There's a rack on the bottom, a big, heavy, sturdy composition, and a locking lid with either weights or an electric dial gauge on top. So in order to use it, you're going to want to pour 2 to 3 inches of water into the bottom. Follow your canner manual for exact measurements. Usually it's 2 to 3 quarts of water. If you have hard water in your area, you can add 1/4 to 1/2 cup of white vinegar to the water in the canner to prevent that mineral buildup on your jars. The other thing we want to make sure is that you're using a tested recipe. So you can use recipes from any cooperative extension, from the USDA Guide to Complete Home Canning, or from the University of Georgia So Easy to Preserve. And we're going to give you the sources for our website towards the end of this presentation. You'll also be emailed it. And we have links to all of these sources on our website. So you have a canner, you've got your recipe. Now, what else do you need? Well, you need regular wide mouth Mason style jars, making sure that the very top, so the lip of the jar, is free from scratches or nicks. Wash those jars in warm soapy water. Also, wash the lids in soapy water and rinse them. We no longer have to keep the lids at simmering. You can just wash them now, and they'll seal for you just fine. You can use regular or wide mouth canning jar lids after you've processed and you've enjoyed them and you want to put them in the refrigerator. You no longer have to use the 2-piece lid. You can get those special storage lids at your grocery store. So we want to keep those jars warm when we're getting ready to can them. So there's a couple different ways that we can prepare straight vegetables for pressure canning. There's a hot pack and a raw pack. And so if you choose to use a raw pack, and again, you're following that tested recipe, you want to keep your jars simmering at about 140 degrees. You can keep them in the canner until you use them. Take them out one at a time and fill them. If you're using a hot pack where you're cooking the vegetables before you put them in the jars, then your water should be about 180 degrees. As I said, when we're pressure canning, we are pressure canning vegetables, soups, meat, fish, pumpkin in chunks, beans, or broth. And so those are the things that you must use your pressure canner for. I know this is repetition, but I feel like we cannot say this enough. Again, we're going to be following a tested recipe. You're going to see a video here in just a little bit, and it will show you step by step how we're going to can carrots, for example. So we've got our recipe out. We're going to wash, peel, and then rewash, slice or cut up the vegetables, place them in a clean hot jar, pour boiling water over the vegetables, and then allow for the headspace that is determined in your recipe. Usually vegetables, it's an inch. And we call this space headspace because there's really nothing above it in the jar. And the amount of space you will notice as you become more experienced with canning, the longer the processing time, the larger the headspace. And the reason is they want to make sure they're exhausting all the air out of that jar. And it's exactly right. If there's too little headspace and it's a long processing time, what's going to happen is the food's going to bubble out up and over the lid. You're going to compromise the lid by getting deposits of food on it, and it's not going to give you a good seal. So follow the directions and fill your jars, and then we're going to wipe the rims with a damp cloth. We're going to free the bubbles. We don't want bubbles. Food produce has air in it in the cells itself, and so if you wiggle a bubble freer around in your jar, it's just going to can better. It's going to be able to exhaust that air better, create a better vacuum. And then we're going to place the lids and tighten the rings, not too tight, or the air won't be able to escape. And so just until it's finger tight, and then just until it meet resistance, and then a little bit more of a turn. Okay, so then we're going to process it, and you'll see in the video how we do this. Going to put the jars in the canner, lock your lid into place, turn the stove to its highest setting, and watch for a free flow of steam for 10 minutes. This is kind of hard to do when you're an early canner, when you're a novice. You are afraid, or at least I was when I was a young canner, I was afraid it was going to boil the canner dry. But trust me on this, the USDA has determined that this is important in order to reach the 240 degrees. You have to exhaust some of that steam. So we want a free flow of steam for 10 minutes, then put that pressure regulator on, let it build up pressure, and then begin your timing. And you'll see all of that in the video. What if you have a weighted gauge? Well, the good news is these are always accurate. You don't have to have your canner gauge tested. We recommend if you have a dial gauge on your canner that it be tested annually. Contact your local extension office for a time to do that. But if you're using a weighted gauge, let the pressure rise until the gauge jiggles, adjust the burner temperature down, and follow, again, your canner manual directions. All right, and so now we're gonna try and show the video. Fingers crossed this is gonna work for us. And I'll just sit back.
Let's prepare carrots using a pressure canner. Follow the directions exactly, and you'll end up with a delicious and safe product. You will need a pressure canner, measuring cups and spoons, a chef's knife, a vegetable peeler, a saucepan or tea kettle, something that you can boil water in, a ladle, pint-sized canning jars with lids and rings, a Headspace measurer and bubble freer. The bubble freer can be a plastic picnic knife, and your Headspace measurer can be a plastic school ruler, a funnel, and a jar lifter. Before we start filling, let's go through this checklist. Of course, we always want to wash our hands with soap and water before we begin. You're going to wash all food contact surfaces with hot soapy water and rinse them well. Assemble your equipment, because once you get started, you're going to want everything at hand. After you've washed your jars, set them aside and pour hot water into the jars so that they are hot when we use them. Only pour the jar out just before filling. And the reason we want to do that is because we want everything to be hot. If you have hard water, you can add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar into the water to prevent water stains on the jars. To prepare your canner, pour 3 quarts of hot water around 140 degrees into the bottom of the canner. It should be 2 or 3 inches of water in the bottom of your canner. The amount of carrot you use will vary depending on whether you're going to make pints or quarts. If you want to make pints, you'll need 11 pounds of carrots. For quarts, 17.5 pounds of carrots. We begin by washing our carrots, and then slice your carrots into equally thick rounds. Empty out your jar, place the wide mouth funnel in the top of the jar, pack the carrot slices tightly into the jars, leaving 1-inch headspace. We're doing a raw pack on these carrots, so just the raw carrots placed into the jar. If you'd like to do a boiling or a hot pack with the carrots, you'd want to cook them on the stove prior to. You can find directions for that in the So Easy to Preserve book from the USDA. Our next step after the carrots are in the jar is to cover the carrots with boiling water, leaving 1-inch headspace. Make sure Let's prepare carrots using a pressure canner. Follow the directions exactly, and you'll end up with a delicious and safe product. You will need a pressure canner, measuring Let's prepare carrots using a pressure canner. Follow the directions exactly, and you'll end up with a delicious and safe product. You will need a pressure canner, measuring cups and spoons, a chef's knife, a vegetable peeler, a saucepan or tea kettle, something that you can boil water in, a ladle. Let's prepare carrots using a pressure canner. Follow the directions exactly, and you'll end up with a delicious and safe product. You will need a pressure canner, measuring cups and spoons, a chef's knife, a vegetable peeler, a saucepan or tea kettle, something that you can boil water in, a ladle, pint-sized canning jars with lids and rings, a Headspace measurer and bubble freer. The bubble freer can be a plastic picnic knife, and your Headspace measurer can be a plastic school ruler, a funnel, and a jar lifter. Before we start filling, let's go through this checklist. Of course, we always want to wash our hands with soap and water before we begin. You're going to wash all food contact surfaces with hot soapy water and rinse them well. Assemble your equipment, because once you get started, you're going to want everything at hand. After you've washed your jars, set them aside and pour hot water into the jars so that they are hot when we use them. Only pour the jar out just before filling. And the reason we want to do that is because we want everything to be hot. If you have hard water, you can add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar into the water to prevent water stains on the jars. To prepare your canner, pour 3 quarts of hot water around 140 degrees into the bottom of the canner. It should be 2 or 3 inches of water in the bottom of your canner. The amount of carrot you use will vary depending on whether you're going to make pints or quarts. If you want to make pints, you'll need 11 pounds of carrots. For quarts, 17.5 pounds of carrots. We begin by washing our carrots and then slice your carrots into equally thick rounds. Empty out your jar, place the wide mouth funnel in the top of the jar, pack the carrot slices tightly into the jars, leaving 1-inch headspace. We're doing a raw pack on these carrots, so just the raw carrots placed into the jar. If you'd like to do a boiling or a hot pack with the carrots, you'd want to cook them on the stove prior to. You can find directions for that in the So Easy to Preserve book from the USDA. Our next step after the carrots are in the jar is to cover the carrots with boiling water, leaving 1-inch headspace. Make sure you measure that. Headspace is very important. Once you have the water in the jar, take a bubble free, a picnic knife will work, and just wiggle it around in the jar, and you can see the air bubbles come up. Then we're going to wipe the rim of the jar with a damp paper towel and place the lid and the ring on the jar and adjust it until it's just finger tight. Then place the jars into your canner that you've prepared with the water and then rotate it so that it locks in place. You will feel it. Turn your burner to high and then watch for steam to escape through the steam vent. What we want to see is a funnel of steam or a free flow of steam for 10 minutes before we put the pressure regulator on top of that pitcock valve. So after 10 minutes, set the pressure regulator on the valve and let the canner build pressure. We want 11 pounds of pressure for this process. What we don't want to do is for the pressure to go very far above the 11. There's safety measures in place, but what we don't want to happen is inside the pressure to build to the extent where the water in the jars could escape through the lid. So make sure we're holding steady at 11 pounds pressure. Follow the directions and making sure that we're setting the timer for 25 minutes if we're doing pints and 30 minutes if we're doing quarts. Stay around in the kitchen, making sure that pressure doesn't go above 11. You also don't want it to go below 11. If your electricity goes off or some unforeseen something happens, you need to stop the timer, get the pressure back to 11 pounds, and start your timer all over again. It must be a full 25 to 30 minutes with no interruption. So once you have maintained that pressure for 25 minutes, turn your stove off and walk away. Do not try and hurry the equalization of pressure process. Let it do it naturally. When the pressure gauge reads 0 and the safety valve is flush with the top of the canner, then you can remove the pressure regulator and remove the lid by rocking back the lock mechanism. Open the lid away from you and then remove the jars with a jar lifter, placing them on a cooling rack or a heavy towel, cutting board, something that's going to protect the surface of your countertops, and allow 1 to 2 inches between the jars. Leave those jars undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. You should hear them seal. The next day, remove the rings, wipe the jars, label those lids with what they are and the date, and store them in a cool, dry, dark place. Use them within a year for best flavor. Canned carrots make a quick, easy side dish for any family meal.
Well, who knew that you can't check the chat while a video is going on? So I'm so sorry about that. I learned something. So after 12 to 24 hours, check your lids for seals. If they're not sealed, remove the lid and check for cracks or nicks. And you can reprocess it using a new lid, or just put it in your refrigerator and use it within 2 or 3 days. We always have a few things that we want to remind people of. Just don't even think about using the open kettle method. So years ago, we used to say hot food, hot jar, hot lid, and everything was good. There's a myth out there that as long as a jar is sealed, it's safe. But remember earlier in this presentation when I said that botulism lives in a sealed jar at room temperature. So we want to make sure we're killing everything inside that jar. And we can't do that just by putting a lid on it. So we also don't want to process, and I put that in quotes, by way of the microwave, oven, slow cooker, dishwasher, or the sun. We don't want to use a pressure cooker to can in. Using jars not designed for home canning. So don't use your spaghetti sauce jars or your mayonnaise jars. Those have been designed to go through one processing at their factory, at the food manufacturers. Don't risk it exploding in your canner. There are Mason style jars, brand name jars in every garage sale on any given weekend in any town across the United States. So go pick up some jars and just make sure they're not nicked or cracked. We don't want you to use one-piece lid instead of the classic two-piece lid and ring. And we don't seal things with paraffin. We used to seal jams and jellies with paraffin. That is no longer recommended. And so we said that we would share with you some of our sources. And I think Jenna will be putting into the chat our website. And we recommend those resources. And again, our website is very comprehensive. To prepare this, we have used those references. And then what we would like you to do is scan the QR code. It's going to ask you some questions on our evaluation, how to make this process a little bit better. We appreciate your feedback. What you don't need to put in there, though, is that the presenter tried to check the chat while the video was going on. So, or you can, I don't care, but I did learn a lesson today. So if you would please take that survey while we're fielding some of these questions. And I'm going to ask Jenna to share those questions with us. And I'll be happy to try and answer those.
Okay, well, thank you, Mary Liz. I never knew that. So I am glad that you were the guinea pig on that one. So now I will know the next time I give a presentation to not check the chat box while a video is playing.
It's just
So,
tempting, you know, you see those little numbers over there and you want to answer people.
Exactly. No, that is exactly right. So, well, we do have some questions. And so we will get to that. And as Mary Liz has mentioned, you know, I did put a link in the chat box. If you could take a few minutes just to fill that out, the evaluation for today, we definitely do appreciate that. And this was a great webinar, Mary Liz. I learned, I'm sure, hopefully many people have learned a lot of great things here. And so I'm just going to get to the questions. One of the question was actually already answered, but it was talking about when you do fill those jars and you're looking for that proper headspace. Once you kind of debubble and it goes below that 1 inch, do you need to add more water? And of course, Mary Liz, the answer is
yes. Add the water before you put the lid on. Yeah, until it gets to be 1 inch. Sometimes you'll notice. Sometimes foods that are a little starchy will absorb some of that liquid during the processing, and you might end up with a little less than 1 inch, but it's okay as long as you put it in the canner at that required headspace, whatever the recipe indicated.
very good. Yes. Okay. So also another question was asked, can you use a pressure canner for both high and low acid food, or is the pressure canner just for low acid foods? Then boiling water,
yeah,
for only
you can. You are allowed to. You can it, but no, you are allowed to. However, some of your more delicate things like whole tomatoes, pickles might have a much softer texture if you can them in a pressure canner as opposed to boiling water bath.
Very good. Here's another great question. If you add acid to your jar, so for example, you're maybe making some pickled dilly beans, does that mean that you still need to use a pressure canner?
Well, your pickled beans would go into a pickle category. As long as you're using an approved recipe, you can process them in a boiling water bath.
Yep.
Just because they're a vegetable. See, a pickled vegetable falls into that high enough acid category to go with a boiling water bath. Again, as long as you're using an approved recipe.
That's right. And now just flip that scenario. I'm just thinking, Mary Liz, you know, some people will say, well, I don't need to add acid maybe to my tomatoes, right? If I'm pressure canning them. What do you say about that?
Well, and you know, in theory, they're correct, but the USDA wants to give a consistent message. So always add acid to your tomatoes. Just blanket, always add acid. And again, like we said, whole tomatoes or even halves or quarters, you might not like the texture coming out of a pressure canner.
Very good. Okay, so we knew this was going to kind of come up, Mary Liz. So the video here showed the carrots, and the water level in that jar is below the level of the carrots. Is that okay?
It's okay. What's going to happen is those carrots might darken a little bit at the top. We started out with the correct headspace. When we were canning, that was a heck of a day. We shot all 3 videos in one little kitchen, and I think it might have gone above pressure a little bit during the canning process, but it's still going to be okay.
Yep, just use them up as quickly as possible.
Yes.
And,
Yeah.
and that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So my mom always made strawberry freezer jam and sealed them with the paraffin wax. Shouldn't do that, right? Even if it goes in the freezer.
If you want to put it in the freezer with paraffin, you can. You know, the freezer jams don't require any processing. So you can put it in a baggie, in a freezer bag if you want to, or in a plastic freezer container. The paraffin on freezer jam is really unnecessary.
Right. Stick to that 2-piece lid.
Yes.
Okay, I make 1-inch meatballs and process them in my pressure canner, but sometimes the broth is below the headspace that I started with. They seal. So are they still okay with the low broth in the jar?
Okay, so my question would be, when you take the lid off that pressure canner, do you smell meatballs? And if that's the case, then maybe some of your broth has bubbled out. And as it has gone up and out of the jar, it might have compromised the seal a little bit. Otherwise, I think you're probably okay, unless it's a lot of liquid that is escaped. I kind of would like to see a picture of it. And you know what? I'm going to type my phone number in the chat. And so if you would like to call me afterwards, and you can tell me what your jars look like.
Okay, very good.
Okay.
Some have asked for being able to access the first 2 videos on the steam canning as well as the boiling water bath canning. And yes, we will send you an email with all of the recordings of all 3 videos, as well as the PowerPoint slides and handouts. Everything will be emailed to you. Just give us a few weeks here to get that all put together, but you can look forward to that in your email inbox. Another question here that came in, she said that she would love to see a video of the weighted gauge when it's rocking. She says, that's where I feel like I don't know what to do. What is the proper rocking of the weight? What's too fast?
Oh my gosh, I think that is an excellent idea. Jenna, add that to our list of a new video.
Absolutely.
I have not used a weighted canner, so I can't really tell you, but that is going to be added to my list as something to learn. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the best thing to do is really to look at that, you know, the kind of manual that comes with the canner. However, a lot of times those manuals are old, maybe they're lost, so it might be hard to locate. But generally, if you have the manual, it'll tell you kind of how many rocking kind of, you know, how many kind of little sounds that it's going to make as it jiggles per minute. Another question that came in, it says, is there a difference between UL listed and UL approved?
Oh, that's a good question, and I don't know it. I don't know the answer to that.
If there is, I have not seen or even, I guess, noticed any kind of difference between UL listed or UL approved. Yeah, we'll have to do a little more research on that one. Look that one
Yeah.
up. Okay, does the produce canned with a pressure canner come out mushy? I've not used this method before. What do you think, Mary Liz?
Well, it's going to be like any kind of canned vegetable. It's not going to be as crisp as frozen, certainly, but you go to the store and you buy a can of carrots, they're going to be soft. They're going to be cooked in the jar. And so it's going to have a very similar texture to a commercially canned item.
Very good. Can jars, lids, and bands be reused?
You can reuse jars and bands, but the lids are for a one-time only.
That's right. So make sure you do buy those lids every time. She says, I have an older canning recipe book. What date published should I look for?
We recommend, or I shouldn't say we, USDA recommends using recipes developed after 1985.
Okay. How do I know if a recipe is approved or not approved?
Well, it should have a source cited. So you go to our website and we provide links to those USDA sites. Or if you're looking through, you can also use like Ball or Kerr, Mrs. Wages. Those are all good recipes as well. But what we don't recommend is something you've gotten on the internet, for example. Try and use an extension source or USDA source.
Very good. We have a few more here. If the pressure goes above 11, do I just reduce the heat to bring it back down?
Yes, and just do it, just a tiny little turn. And you all know your stoves, so you know how your stove responds to turning the knob.
Just looking to see if we have any more here. Yeah, so the kind of response from that, the one on with the rocking, I guess the manual says, or a lot of times those manuals will often say a gentle rock, but what is that?
Yeah, good question. Well,
good question.
Jenna, you and I are going to have to spend this winter working on, well, maybe we can purchase a weighted gauge canner and try it out and figure that out as well.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's another one. Why can you not use a pressure cooker rather than a pressure canner? I always have used a pressure cooker and expect to spend a lot of money and don't want to, spend a lot of money to buy a pressure canner.
Right. So your pressure cookers are usually not big enough to develop the volume of steam and pressure to get it up to that 240 degrees. And that's the deal. It might get it really hot. It might look like it's sealed, but our concern is the 240 degrees. And so you're right. Pressure canners are expensive. You know, you can expect to spend around $100 for one, but it will last you for decades if it's properly cared for.
Well, here's someone that says, I guess that they said they have an electric pressure canner, and my electric pressure canner states that it goes to 11.6 PSI. Is this okay?
Yes, there is something that is an electric pressure canner that is not a pressure cooker. So yeah, very, very separate, specific item. And I think it only holds like 2 or 3 quarts, if I remember correctly. But yes, if that is what it is specifically for, then absolutely you can use that.
I'm finding that the lids made by other producers than Ball corrode.
You're right. You're right. And sometimes they don't seal. And so, you know, I'm not a name brand advocate on anything except canning. And so the Newell company, actually, I think Newell has more recently been bought out by even Rubbermaid. So we used to have Ball and Kerr as 2 separate manufacturers. They joined under the brand name of Newell, and then Newell was bought out by Rubbermaid. But you want to make sure you're getting those name brands.
Absolutely. And during the height of the pandemic, I know there were a lot of kind of different lids that were out there on Amazon that people were ordering. And someone even gave me some, and they're junk. You can tell just by looking at them.
Yep.
So you do have to be very careful. Okay. Do you recommend boiling things for 10 minutes just to be safe? I've been told that that will kill the toxin.
Well, and that's been standard practice for quite some time. Boil them for 10 minutes with the lid off. But if those toxins have developed in the jar, again, remember, we want it 240 to kill it. If you boil it for 10 minutes at 212, you're still not making an unsafe product safe.
Yeah, that's
So
right.
in a nutshell, probably not.
That's right. Okay. Let's see. Can we also get an email to go with the phone number? Mary Liz will definitely put your email
Oh,
in there.
sure.
Absolutely. All right. Let's see here. I have an Emerald Lagasse pressure cooker canner fryer. It's a
No,
multi-function. It will
no.
can pint jars.
You might be able to do like jams and jellies in that if it specifically states that in the jams and jellies in a half pint, but I would not trust it for anything else. That's just trying to do too many things.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that there are a lot of those types of kind of machines, if you will, out there that, they do so many different things. And the book might even say, yeah, use this for canning, but we know that that is not always going to still not going to be the safe method. It may not hold that heat as it should. So we do not, USDA does not recommend it. Yeah. Do you can beans the exact same way as the carrots?
Couple things about beans. Again, you're going to be following the directions that you find from an approved source. Usually the beans are soaked first. I don't know of any canning method where you put dry beans in, and knowing even after you soak them, they're going to absorb some water. So beans probably are going to need a little bit more of a headspace. I assumed you were talking about soup beans. If you're talking about green beans, then it's exactly like the carrots. So, but you can soak and also can dry beans as well.
Very good. Another thing to add to our list here, it says if you have time in the future, it'd be interesting to hear about freezing vegetables properly as well.
Okay, on our website, there are a couple of videos about freezing food. And I think there's specifically a video about freezing green beans. And that is interesting because some vegetables have to be blanched to stop that enzymatic process, to brighten them up and preserve the nutrition, while others don't. So you're going to blanch your snap peas, green beans, carrots, but you don't have to blanch onions or green peppers or red peppers.
Very good. Are there pressure canners to not purchase, or to, do we need to watch out for some of those hand-me-down pressure canners?
Okay. Well, if you're purchasing one, again, look for that Underwriters Laboratory seal or list or whatever is on it. And as far as hand-me-downs, I've tested canners that were 50 years old that are perfectly good. But just watch and make sure that lid fits snugly. If there is a gasket, make sure it's pliable. Now, you can also order replacement parts from Presto or American Standard. And then, of course, if you do get a hand-me-down canner, bring it into your extension office and have that gauge tested.
Okay, here's another one. Are you not allowed to can using an electric coil with Sensi temp? Some people said no, since the temp can go down, but as long as the gauge remains at pressure or the weight is rocking appropriately, wouldn't it still be safe?
Oh, I do not know what an electric coil with a Sensi temp is. But I would say as long as you are able to maintain constant temperature and the gauge stays constantly at 11 pounds, you should be okay. Again, I'm kind of just shooting in the dark here because I have no idea what that is.
Yeah, okay. And what is the exact concern about using a smooth top stove beyond damaging the cooktop?
Okay. Yeah, damaging because of the weight, but also those many of those stoves are designed to only, that you can only use flat bottomed cookware. Most canners have a little lip in them at the bottom. And so it's not going to get the proper amount of heat. And then also just the method that those flat top stoves use, where they get bright red and then they fade away. It's not a constant temperature.
Okay, can you can squash? Would it have to be in a pressure canner?
Absolutely. Squash is a very low acid food. Pumpkin is squash. So you're going to want to can it in cubes. And I'm going to tell you, you're not going to be pleased with the end result. It's going to be pretty mushy. I've really not found a method other than grating squash and freezing it and then use it in breads and cakes. I personally have not found a method that I really am satisfied with the end result.
Yeah. It's pretty watery, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I have a bunch of uncooked tomatoes I put in the freezer. Can I take them out and still can them?
Sure.
Mhm.
In fact, I have a friend, and she doesn't do it so much with tomatoes, but she'll pick her berries in the summer, freeze them, and then in the winter, when her house needs heat and humidity, she makes her jams and jellies then.
Okay.
Pretty smart, really.
I'll put the website for the freezing the video. I'll make sure to put that in the chat box.
Okay.
Let's see here, just looking at a few more. It looks like there was a picture as well that kind of came in with that electric coil. So that is shown there.
Yeah, I'm looking at that now. Is that sensor one?
Yeah,
I don't know. That it looks like a regular electric coil, which is recommended.
yeah, it does. Okay. When you use acids, what are some other acids besides lemon juice?
Okay, well, you can have as we said, the 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, the concentrated lemon juice per quart of tomatoes, or you can use a 1/4 teaspoon of citric acid. And so that's that powdered bottled citric acid. Fruit Fresh is usually a brand name. And then you can use vinegar. But we have the caveat that sometimes vinegar can change the flavor.
Okay, and we've got another one that came in. How is the quality of sweet corn pressure canned versus
Well,
freezing?
Canned corn is canned corn. The other thing that we have to be careful of when we're canning corn in the pressure canner is that, again, very starchy, so it's going to absorb some water. The other thing that we sometimes see is it's super interesting. In a jar of corn that's been pressure canned, sometimes you'll see some browning where some of the sweetness, some of the sugar and the corn has actually caramelized in the canning process. So freeze it. That's my recommendation.
Okay. I just put in the chat box just a link to one of the videos on freezing. This one talks about, I believe, freezing green beans, but there's a few more, and I'll put the link to as well for more of the videos that you might also find. If you kind of scroll down, you should be able to find these videos. So I'll put that link in there right now. And it looks like that is about all the questions that have come in. We've had a lot of them, which is good. It's great to be able to chat and to answer those questions as best as what we can. So we do appreciate all of you for taking the time to listen today and to ask those questions. Mary Liz, anything else?
Just I echo exactly what you said. Thank you all for asking questions. We love the questions. Feel free to contact me anytime this time of year. I love answering those canning questions. It's very rewarding, and I always learn something too. So thank you all for joining us. Have a good rest of your day, and happy and safe canning to you all.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Do we need to stop the recording, Jenna?
Yeah, Mary Liz, you want me to, I don't see